Dragon Shield just came out with their new dual sleeves, which are just like their other sleeves, except they have a black background instead of a white background when you put your cards in there. So they're super slick looking, and they have a clear glossy front, so it shows off all your foils really well. Check them out on dragonshield.com. Use my affiliate link down below. It helps support the channel. Hey guys, welcome to BudgetEDH. I'm your host Mike, and on this week's episode we bring you Edgar Markov budget upgrades with the new cards from Crimson Vow. Edgar is 3, a red, a white, and a black for a legendary creature, Vampire Knight. It has Eminence. Whenever you cast another vampire spell, Edgar is in the command zone or on the battlefield, create a 1/1 black vampire creature token. He has first strike and haste. Whenever he attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. Now, when we originally made this deck tech, Edgar was not the price that you see here in the video. He was not a $100 card. If you made this deck back when we originally made it, you probably made some money off of our deck list just due to Edgar's raising price. He has become scarce to get. $100 for this card is more than the original deck that we actually built with Edgar in it. If you had the original deck, this is a great upgrade that you can make to it to make your deck a little bit more powerful and up to date. So a little over a year ago, we built an Edgar Markov $100 budget deck tech, and we have a YouTube video going over that deck tech in detail. Check the show notes down below to take a look at that full deck list, the full video going over all the decisions that we made in that deck. And with Crimson Vow, it brings us more vampires that potentially could go into our Edgar Markov deck. So I wanted to take a look at that deck that we built. It's one of my favorite decks that I've built since starting this channel. I play it all the time. I was really excited to crack that deck open and make some adjustments based on some of the new cards that came out. So these are some of the adjustments I made to my deck. Let me know down in the comments below if you agree or disagree with some of the decisions that we make, but we're going to go through real quickly. Around 10 cards we're going to add to the deck, 10 cards we're going to remove. Check out the original video for the full deck list, all the full breakdown of this deck. I'm going to do a quick breakdown on the deck, quick stats on the deck with the new updates. Not much is changing here, more of the same stuff, just more efficient cards that we put in here that work a little bit better with what we're trying to do. So first up, Edgar is a tribal vampires deck. We have over 30 vampires in here. We're going to focus mostly on low converted mana cost creatures. So we're going to lean heavily into vampires that are 1 or 2 converted mana cost. We want to play those low converted mana cost creatures so that when Edgar is in our command zone, he has that Eminence ability that when we play a vampire, we're going to get a vampire token to kind of go along with it. We can get a lot of creatures onto the board, and then with those tokens that we have on there, we have a lot of ways of pumping our vampires up with all of the vampire lords that are in here. A lot of different ways that we have of making our vampires bigger with +1/+1 counters. That's something vampires are just good with in general. And then we do have a slight aristocrats sub theme because vampires are so good in that strategy as well. It's not our main strategy. We're not going to win with infinite combos or any of that stuff. We're going to win primarily through combat damage, but it is nice to get some incremental damage on our opponents with that aristocrats theme if our vampires die, and we do have a lot of vampires in here. Next up, let's quickly go over some of the stats that are in this deck, and this is with the upgrades in the deck. So we've got 9 ramp spells in here. Now with this deck, there's a lot of low converted mana cost. The curve is very low, so the need for ramp isn't as extreme in some of the higher converted mana cost decks that you may see. We do have 9 ways of drawing cards in this deck. 5 pieces of interaction, both single removal and or board wipes go into that. We've got 39 vampires. Vampires are absolutely critical to this deck. We want to be able to play a vampire or more on every single turn, so we're able to churn out those tokens with Edgar's Eminence ability and eventually win the game with Edgar dropping down onto the board with haste and pumping all of our tokens up. We've got 12 combat tricks / pump to make our vampires bigger, and then our land count in here a little bit low at 34, but like I said, our converted mana cost in this deck is extremely low, so most of the cards in here are going to be 2 mana cost or less. So you're going to see an average converted mana cost of less than 3, which means you don't need to have a very high land count in this deck. Next up, we're going to go over some of the cards that we added to this deck. Now, we are going to try to stay around 10 cards that we are going to add and remove to this deck, and we are going to still try to stay within our budget range on this deck. Edgar is up to about $100 for the commander card, so hopefully you have one sitting around. Hopefully you bought our deck when we built it the first time, but we are going to stick to a similar budget. The first couple of times I played this deck, it became very apparent to me that I needed to have some form of haste because those vampires that enter the battlefield do not have haste, and we are kind of an aggro deck. So haste is important to make sure that we're able to get that combat damage in our opponents before they are able to remove whatever threats we have through a board wipe or through single targeted removal. So opted to go with a couple of ways of giving our creatures haste in here. First of which is anger. I really like anger a lot. It is very cheap. If you have ways of discarding and getting it into your graveyard, it provides a ton of value for your creatures, giving you haste across the board. So whenever you play a vampire, that vampire is going to have haste, and then also the vampire that comes in off of Edgar's Eminence ability is also going to have haste too. So you can get a lot of damage in really quickly with anger, and it allows you to make sure that you're going to get that damage in. It's really like anger in here. It's only $1.44. I think it's a great inclusion for the deck. The next card I'm going to add into this deck, a little bit pricier, but it's just a great inclusion in just about any commander deck. It's Lightning Greaves. So Lightning Greaves gives single creature haste and shroud. So some of your really great vampires in here, you can equip the Lightning Greaves to. Let's just use Captivating Vampire as an example. You can tap vampires down to take control of creatures. This not only will give that haste so you can attack with it, but more importantly, it'll actually protect your creatures too. So you'll be able to protect your key threats. Edgar, you can protect all of your really good vampires. Some of the ones that we'll talk about here in a second too. You can protect and also give them haste so you can swing in for that combat damage as well. Just a very, very good card in just about any commander deck. Next up, I'm going to talk about another couple of cards that actually go well with anger, and that is Faithless Looting. Faithless Looting, super cheap card. It's pretty much a staple in red decks. It lets you draw 2 cards, then you discard 2 cards, and it has flashback so you can do it a second time. So it lets you kind of filter through your deck to try to find the pieces that you're looking for. In our case, if we have something like anger, we can actually discard it, and it becomes an advantage for us to discard that card, which is really nice as well. The deck was kind of lacking in the card draw department. In addition, we also have Thrilling Discovery, which is a newer one out of Strixhaven that I really like. It lets you gain 2 life, then you can discard 2 cards if you do draw 3 cards. So again, more ways of getting that discard and filtering through your deck as well. Next up, we've got a land. So I'm actually going to take a swamp out of this deck and add this land in. This should be a staple for a vampire deck. It's a new one out of Crimson Vow. It's Voldaren Estate. Taps for a colorless mana. You can pay 1 life and add 1 mana of any color. You can only spend it to cast a vampire spell, and you can pay 5 and tap it to create a blood token. It costs 1 less to activate for each vampire you control. And then blood tokens are pay 1 and tap it, discard a card, sack this artifact, and draw a card. So it's basically a way of looting on a token, which is really nice. So I really like this land. It's super cheap. It just came out in Crimson Vow. It always taps for mana. There's not a huge downside to running this in your deck. It also will tap for all colors of mana as long as you're casting a vampire spell, which we have 40 of them in here. And in a 3-color deck, being able to tap for all 3 colors of mana is extremely important. So I really like including this in the deck at such a low cost. I think it's great in a vampire deck. Next up, we're going to talk about the creatures that we're going to add to this deck, and we're going to add 6 different vampires in here that are going to help with our overall strategy. So first up, we've got Voldaren Stinger. The main reason that this is in the deck is it's a 1-mana vampire, which 1-mana vampires are extremely critical in here. Being able to get this down on turn 1 to put a 1/1 on the board. This also has first strike as long as it's attacking and can pump. And also getting another 1/1 token off of Edgar is huge. So this is awesome. I love how quickly things can spiral out of control in this deck, and you can get a lot of vampires onto the board very quickly, and then you can pump them up in subsequent turns to get a ton of damage in on your opponents. So 1 mana vampires with basically any ability are going to be critical to adding into this deck. Next up, we've got another vampire that came out a little bit after we made this deck tech, so it wasn't in there when we made the original one. It 100% would have been if it had come out after. It's Knight of the Ebon Legion out of M20. Another 1 mana vampire. This one's a little bit better than the last one we just talked about, but has a ability where you can pay 3 mana and it gets +3/+3 and gains death touch in it until end of turn. And then at the beginning of your end step, if your player lost 4 or more life, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Very likely that you're going to get that trigger most turns with this deck because you're going to be dealing a lot of damage to your opponents. This was actually a pretty expensive card when it was standard legal. It was being played in some standard decks because of how powerful it was. So very good card to put in here, and it's cheap now because it's not in standard anymore. So pick this up, put it into your deck. We'll talk about some of the cards that you can replace. Next up, we've got one out of Midnight Hunt. I really like this card a lot. It's Vampire Socialite. It's a 2 mana vampire. Again, 1 and 2 mana is critical for us. It's got Menace, not super easy to block. When it enters the battlefield, if an opponent lost life this turn, you can also put a +1/+1 counter on each vampire you control. So not just on this vampire, but all your vampires. So that's absolutely amazing. Next up, we got a little bit of a pricier one. It's also out of Midnight Hunt. Lots of vampires in the last 2 sets. Got Bloodthirsty Adversary. It's another 2 mana vampire. This one's got haste. Really like this one. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 mana any number of times. When you pay this cost 1 or more times, put that many +1/+1 counters on Bloodthirsty Adversary, then exile up to that many target instant sorcery cards with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard and copy them. You can cast the number of copies without paying their mana costs. This card is awesome. So if you draw this late in the game, you can pump a lot of mana into this. It's going to get bigger. It also has haste, so it can swing it onto your opponents the turn it enters the battlefield. You also have a bunch of interaction spells in here and also card draw spells that this can copy when it enters the battlefield based on the number of counters that you put on it, which makes this card really powerful. Gives you a lot for its cost, which I really like. So definitely worth including. And then last but not least, as far as cards that we're going to add to this deck, got a newer one out of Crimson Vow. We've got Voldaren Bloodcaster. It's a 2 mana vampire that actually can flip over. So it's got flying. It's a 2/1 flyer for 2. Whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, create a blood token. So blood tokens are pretty nice little loot rocks, I guess. And whenever you create a blood token, if you control 5 or more of them, you can transform this into Bloodbat Summoner. So this is a 3/3 flyer. At the beginning of combat on your turn, up to 1 target blood token you control becomes a 2/2 black bat creature with flying and haste in addition to its other types. And I just want to note that this does not say until end of turn. So it turns our blood tokens into bats permanently. Just an insane card. Really like this card a lot. It absolutely 100% has a home in this deck, especially with some of the other blood interaction that we have, but super awesome card, super cheap again, just like all the other cards that we included. All right, so next up, let's quickly go over some of the cards that we're going to remove. Now, I don't have the prices on here. The prices are irrelevant, but just quickly why I'm taking the card out to replace with some of the other cards that we talked about. So first, we've got Blood Crazed Paladin. It's a 2 mana vampire. Enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each creature that died this turn. Doesn't really have a huge impact. I have played this to where it has gotten +20/+20 and I've won the game, but more often than not, this is just sits in your hand. You don't ever want to hold mana up with this deck to play this out with flash, so it just ends up being a 1/1 for 2 most times, which isn't super good when we can get 1/1s or better for 1 mana. So definitely an easy one to cut in my opinion for some of the cheaper vampires. Next up, we've got Victim of Night. It's a 2 mana removal spell. It has a bunch of stipulations here, which aren't like super relevant most times, but right now they are pretty relevant. It's destroy target non-vampire, non-werewolf, non-zombie. Now, 6 months from now or whatever, you could probably put this card back into your deck, but with people making a bunch of Midnight Hunt decks, Wilhelt is a popular one, Tolivar is a popular one that I really enjoy playing, and I see a lot of people playing playing these tribal decks. You're going to see more vampire decks. There's going to be more Edgar decks running around. Definitely cut this card, because if you're running against any of those decks, this is like almost going to be a dead card against those. You might be able to kill a Land of War Elves or something like that, or a support creature, but you don't want to be sitting with a 2-mana dead card in a deck that's supposed to be more aggressive. So let's just cut that out. Maybe we can reassess and put it back later, but there's so many good removal spells now. Infernal Grasp is a new one that just came out that destroys a creature and you lose 2 life, that you do not need to put Victim of Night in your deck anymore. Next up, we've got Utter End. It's a 4-mana removal spell that exiles any non-land permanent. I like this in a lot of decks. I play it in most black-white decks. I don't super like it in this deck because it costs a lot. So it's a 4-mana removal spell. We're trying to be aggressive. I'm not trying to hold mana up to play Utter End. If I have to hold mana up, I'm most likely going to be losing and I'm going to get blown out to a board wipe or something like that. So I'd rather just play out my threats, get them on the board, not trying to hold out mana. I'm tapping out every turn. So for that reason, I am cutting Utter End. It's a great card. Don't get me wrong. I just don't think it has a great place in this deck. We would rather be lower on the mana curve for a removal. Next up, we are cutting a Swamp in place of Voldaren Estate. Not much to say here other than I did want to swap out and get Voldaren Estate in there, so I'm just going to remove a Swamp for it. Next up, we've got a pretty powerful Aristocrats engine. We've got Bonavoolamog. Whenever it or another non-token creature you control dies, you create a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn. Now, most times I love having this in my deck, but we're kind of in a weird spot where we're trying to be super aggressive. We do have some Aristocrats theme going on, but it's not the main theme of our deck. If it was, then this card would be great in here, but we don't really get any value off those Eldrazi spawns because we're not ramping into anything. They don't deal any damage. They're just 0/1s, and they're not really going to give us a ton of value if we sacrifice them or anything as well. So for all those reasons, I think this is an easy cut. It doesn't have a whole lot of synergy in our deck because we're not super heavy into the Aristocrats theme. It's just a very small sub theme in here. Next up, we've got Mortify. Removing this one, very narrow and very costly removal spell. Destroys a creature and enchantment. Again, like with the Utter End, don't really want to have expensive removal spells. Would rather stay low to the ground. We don't want to hold our mana up. We want to cast our creatures, get our value, and try to kill some of our opponents before they kill us. Earlier in the video, we talked about low converted mana cost creatures. We're going to cut Maverin Fane Dusk Apostle. 3 converted mana cost for a 2/2 vampire. It does have a little bit more of a powerful ability on here. Whenever one or more non-token vampires you control attack, you get to create a 1/1 vampire creature token with lifelink. If that said, whenever a non-token vampire you control attacks, you get a 1/1. 100% that would be one of the better cards in the deck, but it's whenever it's 1 or more. So you could attack with 10 vampires, you're still going to get 1, or you can attack with 1 vampire, you're going to get 1 token. So not super great for the 3 mana cost. It's very borderline, a very mediocre card in my opinion. Much rather have a lot of other things in the deck. On the same note, we've got Forerunner of the Legion. It's a vampire knight for 3 mana. Enters the battlefield, you search your library for a vampire card, reveal it, shuffle it, and put it on top. Whenever another vampire enters the battlefield under control, target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So it's like Vampiric Tutor for vampires. Puts it on the top of your deck, which is nice, but I mean, what are we really trying to search out? There's nothing like, we're basically playing a bunch of 1 and 2 mana little dorks that we're going to be attacking with and getting tokens and then pumping them up later. This is nice to get a Lord, but for 3 mana to search your library, and then it gives you a very minimal effect when it's on the board. Just don't think it's that great. I'd rather have a 1 mana 1/1 that has some upside in this deck over this card. Next up, we've got dronus Emissary that we're going to remove. 3 mana vampire. It's a 2/2 flyer that drains each opponent 1 life and you gain 1 life at the beginning of your upkeep. Not great in this deck because we have no synergy with life gain. So when I originally made this deck, I'm not sure why I put this card in. I didn't go back and like rewatch the video or anything, but I really don't think that this is a great card in this deck. Looking back, I definitely should not have included this. There is literally no reason for this card to be in here. There is no life gain at all. Then we've got Blade of the Blood Chief. Super slow card. 1 mana artifact equipment. Whenever a creature dies, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it. And if equipped creature is a vampire, put 2 +1/+1 counters on it instead, and you can equip it for 1. Not a huge fan. I don't know why I put this in the original deck. I don't think it's very good. If you get your vampire kind of pumped up, they can just kill the vampire and then you lose all your counters and you got to start over. The equip cost and cost of the equipment are very good. I just think it's a very slow card. We're trying to be quick. We're trying to be aggressive, so easy cut. And last but not least, we're going to get rid of Bantu's Monument. I really like this card a lot, but we're playing a 3-color deck, and Bantu's Monument reduces the cost of black creature spells. So if we were in a mono black or maybe even a 2-color deck, I could definitely see keeping Bantu's Monument in the deck. But we're 3 colors, and in addition, a lot of our creatures have 1 colored mana in their cost, or it's 2-colored mana. There's not a lot of generic cost reduction that's going to actually take place with this in the deck. The other ability is not very good in our deck. It doesn't have a lot of synergy with it. So whenever you cast a creature spell, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. I guess it's okay in some decks, but definitely not good in this one. We have no synergy at all with life gain, which we just talked about. So we're not going to get any value off of it. It's literally just going to drain our opponents. Thank you so much for watching our video today. If you like this video and you want to see more Budget Commander content, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And you can also check us out on patreon.com/BudgetEDH. There's a bunch of different tiers and ways to interact with us outside of YouTube. We'll see you guys next time.